Hi, welcome to our home bar and welcome to our YouTube channel, Wise Whiskey. I'm Tony, and today we're going to talk about the barrel aging process. Why is whiskey aged in barrels? That's the first thing we're going to target, just understanding the why, the mechanics of it. But then we're going to get into some of the different types of whiskey, the requirements for those, and then some of the marketing terms that are used around barrel aging and barrel finishing. So, it's important to remember that other than moonshine or what's called white dog, all whiskey is aged in barrels. Legally, in the United States, to make a straight bourbon or a straight rye or a straight wheat whiskey, you have to age those whiskeys in a new charred American oak barrel for at least 2 years. Oftentimes, when you look at other styles of whiskey, particularly international, they're not using new barrels. They're going to age in used barrels. And like I said, we'll talk about what that means down the road, but just laying out the framework right now, kind of what kind of barrels are used when they're making these products. So why do we age in barrels? A lot of times people think that aging in a barrel, particularly since it makes a liquid darker, they tend to think it makes it heavier, maybe more bitter or smoky, a lot more intense. And while it can change the intensity of flavors, it typically does it in a way that's different than what most people expect. I'm not going to go into a bunch about smoking and peating whiskey, but it's important to understand that pretty much all smoky flavor notes do not come from the barrel. You might get light notes of char or things like that, but when you have a heavily smoked whiskey, that's due to the malt or the grain that's used being smoked. Typically with Scotch, you're seeing that with peat, but you can see other smokes as well, or other grains or woods, different things used to smoke the grains. Sorry if I got a little goofy there, but our dog Olaf decided to come make a guest appearance on the show, and apparently my legs smell good this morning. So, the reason for barrel aging, more than anything else, is actually filtration. So if you've ever had a Brita water pitcher and you've put the little filter piece in and you run the water through it and those little black specks come out, those are specks of activated charcoal, activated carbon. They're what acts as a barrier and they help strip out impurities. So when you char the inside of an oak barrel, you're creating charcoal or activated carbon. When you have spirits in a barrel, as the temperature and pressure and things like that outside fluctuate, the barrel is going to expand and contract. So what happens is that liquid is, when the barrel expands, that liquid is withdrawn and absorbed into the wood. When the barrel contracts, it pushes it back out. Every time that happens, you have the liquid going through your activated carbon barrier and filtering the liquid out. So for the first couple of years, the main thing you're going to impart with a barrel is you're going to filter the liquid. You're going to smooth out the sharp edges. You're going to take away some of the impurities. You're going to make an easier drinking product. And you're going to start to change the color. You'll start to get some of that caramel coloring that we think of when we think of whiskey. As you let it age longer, you're going to start to get flavors like vanilla, brown sugar, caramel, a lot of those sweeter notes. That's where those really come through, is early on. You really start to get really up until that like 6 to 8 year mark, sometimes even a little longer than that, 10 years or so. That's where you're really getting those sweet notes. So you're getting a softer whiskey that's less sharp, that's more well-rounded, and it's starting to get sweeter. As you progress into the 12, 15 and above years of aging in a barrel, that's when you start to get some of the darker, more earthy and tannic notes that can come from a barrel, like actually starting to taste woody, leather, tobacco, raisins, really dark stewed fruit. Sometimes even an earthy, almost dirt-like note. Those come from the barrel at some point hits an area where you've aged it long enough that instead of those sweeter compounds, flavor compounds you're pulling out, you start to get the more savory, darker, more tannic flavors coming out. So that's how barrel aging works and while it's done. The next thing to understand, now that you have the basics of what barrel aging is even doing, is understanding the way that climate impacts that. We talked about the fact that temperature changes in particular really have an impact on how that barrel impacts the flavor. The expanding and the contracting is what moves the liquid through into and out of the wood in the barrel. So think about just within a rickhouse, just within the single climate of a rickhouse, which is the warehouse that whiskey is stored in. A lot of those rickhouses are, multiple stories high. Well, heat rises. So what that means is as we deal, or as a barrel sits at the bottom of a rickhouse, it's going to see pretty much the natural rising and falling of temperatures. But as you get higher up in that rickhouse, because heat rises, you'll see more intense variations in temperature. So Benchmark in their line of whiskeys actually has one called Top Floor. And the idea of Benchmark Top Floor is that all of the barrels featured in that have been aged exclusively in the top floor. So even though it's not as old as some other whiskeys, you do get more barrel character in there because of the higher temperature. So just like within a rickhouse, changing the elevation can change the temperature impact on that barrel. Think about the radical differences in geography that we find with whiskeys. There are plenty of whiskeys just from the United States that are coming from the Pacific Northwest, Texas and Arizona, obviously Tennessee and Kentucky. You've got stuff made in upstate New York. You've got things in Colorado. Lots of different climates. That impacts the whiskey. A Texas whiskey has much more exposure to high heat. And when we do have seasonal changes, you tend to see major swings from low to high. Oftentimes on a winter day in Texas, you might have a low in the 30s or 40s and still get up into the 60s or 70s that afternoon. That's going to create a lot of expansion and contraction in your barrels. Kentucky has a milder season than that. It does not get as hot. It does get colder, but it does not get as hot, and it doesn't get as hot for a sustained period of time. It takes longer to age whiskey in Kentucky than it does in Texas. And a lot of times, Texas whiskeys will have, even younger ones, will have a very intense barrel forward flavor to them because of the weather conditions there. A 2 to 4 year old Texas whiskey can taste like an 8 to 10 year old Kentucky whiskey. Now, the same thing goes when you try to compare Kentucky to Scotland or Ireland. Scotland is mostly damp, cool throughout the year. There's a lot of precipitation. You don't see a lot of wild temperature swings. So one of the reasons you see such higher age statements on Scotch than you do bourbon is because the climate means that you're going to need to leave it in the barrel longer to really get an impact. The other difference there is, again, we talked at the beginning that a lot of Scotch uses old barrels. So legally in Texas or in the United States, you have to use new barrels. Now you can do what's called barrel finishing, which we'll get into. But in Scotland, oftentimes they take their distillate and put it straight into used barrels. They use a lot of old American bourbon barrels. They also use a lot of ex-wine barrels, in particular sherry barrels, which are a type of wine from Spain. Now, depending on how often those barrels have been used, two things can happen. The older a barrel is and the more things have been put into it, the less of the actual barrel flavors itself, the caramel, the vanilla, the tobacco, the leather, those notes that we associate oftentimes in bourbon, you don't find as much in Scotch because those barrels have already been used by other things and they've taken a lot of those original flavor compounds out of the wood. What you tend to get instead is a lot more flavors contributed by whatever was in the barrel previously. If you have a red wine barrel and you're using that to age your whiskey, you're going to get notes that are more like red wine, spices, dark fruits. If you use ex-bourbon barrels, you're going to get more bourbon style thing. You're going to get a little more sweetness. You're going to get some of those kind of chocolatey and caramel notes and things like that. And so you start with finished whiskeys, in particular like Scotch and everything. They're very good about advertising what they're finished in. You kind of know what to expect because of because of what was in the barrel before. Now, the other thing to remember though is in Scotland they might even reuse a barrel multiple times. Well, each time you use that barrel, you're going to take away more and more of the flavor compounds, and you're going to leave behind different ones. So a lot of times when you're buying Scotch, you'll see that they were aged in first fill sherry cask or first fill ex-bourbon cask. That means that after the wine or whiskey that was originally aged in that barrel was taken out and the barrel was sold to the distillery in Scotland, whatever you're drinking that day is the first thing to have been put in that barrel since. So you know that there's probably still some barrel character left, but you can be guaranteed you're going to get an impact from whatever was in that barrel because it's a first fill. But as things are used a second, third, or even more, you're going to get less and less impact from the barrel. They even do something now called STR, where they shave and then they rechar the barrels and basically start over from scratch with them. And you will see some distilleries doing STR barrels now. So understanding that can really help you understand what to look for with Scotch whiskey. If we go back to American whiskey, we know that it's aged in new oak. So what happens from there? Well, there are some things now that are very popular, some trends and styles that are extremely popular that you'll see regularly. And I want to talk about each of those real quick. The first would be finished whiskey. So finished whiskey means that after it's been aged in a new oak barrel and it's pretty much matured to the point where they're ready to sell it, they decide, typically for a few weeks, maybe a couple months, to let it sit in another type of barrel just to impact the flavor in a different way. And you can do that by doing the same thing we just talked about with Scotch. You could use ex-rum cask, ex-bourbon cask. You can finish it in pretty much anything you want. One of the better finished whiskeys, or two of the more interesting ones we have, this Barrel Seagrass. It's one of my wife's favorite pours. This is a cask strength rye whiskey, but it's been finished in a mix of Martinique rum, Madeira, which is fortified wine, and apricot brandy barrels. So as you can imagine, aging this in a mix of like port or Madeira style cask, apricot brandy, and rum, you get all kinds of fruity and sweet notes in there. Very unique whiskey. On the other side, we have this Hard Truth. This was a single barrel that we were able to get called Maple Brûlée. And they took their rye whiskey, they sold some of their cask that had whiskey in it to a place that makes maple syrup. And they did whiskey barrel aged maple syrup. Then they sent that cask back to Hard Truth. Hard Truth charred the maple syrup in there to give it an even more complex flavor, and then took their rye whiskey and put it in there for a period to finish it. So this has all kinds of candy and sweet notes from the maple syrup itself, from the charring of the maple syrup. Just a really interesting pour. You still taste the rye whiskey, you still get the base of that American whiskey, but then you start to get flavors impacted from the barrels they're finished in. The other side of finishing that's extremely popular with American whiskeys right now are finishing them in a second new cask. So not something that had other spirits or wine in it before, but something that's either a different type of char, a different type of toast, or a different type of wood altogether. Maker's 46 is probably one of the most famous kind of originators of this style. Maker's 46 was Maker's Mark that was then aged longer in French oak so that it had different flavors imparted there. You tend to get kind of spicy notes, just some really interesting flavors from French oak. Probably the most popular barrel for finishing, doing an oak finish, is French oak. You'll see some people doing, a very few people doing Hungarian oak. You'll occasionally see other types of oak, but by far French oak is the most popular. Mizunara, which is a Japanese style. And then Another one that's really popular, I don't believe it's in the oak family, but I could be wrong on that. But there's a wood called Amburana from South America, which is going to give almost like snickerdoodle cookies or cinnamon toast crunch flavors to the whiskey. Now, they can be very strong. So if you like those flavor notes, just be ready. Oftentimes an Amburana whiskey is going to taste almost like it's been artificially flavored, but that's just coming from the barrel. The two categories of finish that I think you see the most now, though, are double oak and toasted. And I think that there is some confusion on that. So what I have in front of me today, this is the Barrel Foundation Double Oak. This is a really great $50 to $55 bottle. And with double oak, they're going to take and do the normal process. Then they're going to put it in another barrel, typically the same as the barrel it was distilled in to begin with. We're talking about charred new oak. The point of doing that is you just get this extra little surge of flavor and unique character when you do it. A lot of times you'll get slightly sweeter notes like chocolate or marshmallow with double oak. So, I mean, on the nose, caramel, chocolatey, almost like s'mores a little bit. There's a little bit of like toasted marshmallow in there. Definitely sweeter than a typical bourbon, or sweet in a different way. There is a little bit of char in there. You can kind of tell that this has a little bit more barrel influence to it. But not at all those darker notes. You're not getting the tannins. You're not getting the tobacco, the leather, the really dark fruit. You're getting this really great sweetness, slight spiciness. That's just a great pour. Double oaked bourbons, I find some people who aren't wild about just bourbon, double oak tends to be one that can be a great gateway because it does have some interesting sweeter notes and a little bit different flavor. And they can, even though they are bolder flavor, they are typically a little softer at the same time because of that extra barreling. I love double oaked bourbons and ryes. I think they're fantastic. And then you'll also see toasted. Now, what toasted means is that second barrel, instead of having that heavy char or along with heavy char, parts or all of the barrel have been lightly toasted. And those are going to give some other notes. Some of them will still give you that marshmallow in particular, some of that sweetness. You do get some like more toast forward, kind of just like, toasted grain, like some kind of warmer soft notes like that. Again, toasted bourbons, I'm usually a really big fan of those as well. Toasted ryes, just some really great bottles. But all it is doing is putting it back into another barrel that has a slight different finish on it for, again, typically a couple weeks or a couple months, just to impart some unique characters. The one thing that kind of doesn't make sense is you would think that, okay, I put it in a second barrel that's charred or that's toasted. It almost sounds like toasted or double oaked would be like heavier and darker and like more intense. That's not really the case. They're really kind of sweeter and a little richer. And it just comes again because our concept, I think our brain wants us to think oak and char and dark and intense. And we don't just naturally assume filtration and purifying. But that really is what we're doing in the barrel unless we take it a really long time in there. I hope that this was useful. It's definitely one of the parts of whiskey tasting that until you understand can really be confusing and can really honestly make you misconceive what's available out there or what you might be getting when you buy something. So hopefully this helps clear some of that up. If you have any questions about particular types of barrels or anything regarding this kind of topic with barrel aging and barrel finishing, love to hear from you in the comments. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy what we're doing and you'd like to support us. And until next time, as always, I'm going to ask that you please drink responsibly, drink respectfully, but most of all, have fun doing it. Cheers. Thank you for joining me.